Hi, everyone, and thanks for coming to my talk. I'll be talking today about how gender and TV features on pronouns have been traditionally analyzed in formal semantics and pragmatics, and why I believe this traditional approach is lacking in certain aspects. So projecting inferences are a very common topic in our field, and there are two questions that we usually ask about them. One is, why do certain pieces of meaning project in the first place? That is why they fail to interact with the semantic operators in whose syntactic scope they seem to appear. And this is known as the triggering problem, which historically has been less studied than the second problem, which is known as the projection problem, which is the question of how a given projecting inference is computed relative to a given local context. And within this traditional approach, people usually make the following assumptions. One assumption is that the specific form of the inference is typically taken as a given and is assumed to be irrelevant for our theories of projection. And the second assumption is that the various projecting inferences fall into several natural classes characterized by a range of properties uniformly, and in particular by a specific projection pattern. And traditionally, one of these natural classes is assumed to be presuppositions. Now, the standard approach is typically extended to 5 features on pronouns, including gender. So the standard story for gender is that grammatical gender on human referring pronouns is assumed to contribute projecting inferences about the reference gender, whatever that gender is. People furthermore assume a direct one-to-one mapping between grammatical gender and this nebulous category of real-life gender. So you will often see examples like one in the literature. If Skylar brings her dog, I will give you $10. Sentences like this are often assumed to give rise to an inference that Skylar is a woman or Skylar is female. And this inference is often analyzed as a lexically encoded presupposition and is assumed to project as such. Now, it has been known for a while that gender on pronouns doesn't in fact behave like other things that we also label as presuppositions in certain local contexts. So for example, in 3, we have 3 items that are often considered presupposition triggers, but their presuppositions are not satisfied globally. However, the counterfactual antecedent in each case creates a local context that does satisfy the presupposition of the target item. And this is enough to license that item. So for example, you can say, if Mia was in the library, Leah would be there too, without Mia actually being in the library. Now, the same is not true for gender. It has been claimed in the literature that if you know that Skylar is a woman, you cannot say, if Skylar was a man, I would buy him flowers. You have to say, I would buy her flowers. You have to use the form that matches the actual gender of the referent. Now, I make a similar observation for TV features on pronouns in languages that make this distinction, including Russian. Now, in case you don't know, in some languages, when you're talking to a single individual, you have a choice between using T forms, which are morphosyntactically singular and are considered more informal, roughly speaking, and V forms, which are morphosyntactically plural and are considered more formal. So if you're talking to someone with whom you normally use V forms, you cannot use a counterfactual antecedent to license T forms in the consequent. You cannot say something like, если бы мы с вами были на ты бы меня называла Аня. Ouch. No, you cannot do that. You have to say, если бы мы с вами были на ты, вы бы меня называли Аня. You still have to use V forms in the consequent. Now, because the gender inferences do not project like regular presuppositions, it has been proposed to treat them as so-called indexical presuppositions. That is, they should be linked to something in the context of utterance. Here's, for example, an entry for she under this view. So whatever the internal composition of this pronoun is, it ends up having a presupposition that the referent of this pronoun is female in the world of the context of utterance C. A similar treatment has been proposed for TV features on pronouns. For example, Schlenker gives the following entry for the French T pronoun tu. Again, whatever the internal composition of this pronoun is, it ends up having a presupposition that the speaker of the context C believes in the world of the context, that they stand in a familiar relation to the addressee. And that's the standard story. And I'm going to show you today that this story simply doesn't have enough explanatory power to account for all the diverse patterns of pronoun use that we actually observe. And I want to treat this as a case study that helps us see the various methodological shortcomings of our general approach to investigating projecting inferences. So let's start by taking a closer look at pronouns in local contexts. Now, isn't it true that in these counterfactual local contexts, the judgments are almost categorical? You have to use the actual form, not the counterfactual one. But what if you don't know what the actual form is? Now, it has been claimed in the literature for gender that if you don't know the reference gender, then you can just use the form supplied by the local context. So it has been claimed that in a context in which you don't know Skylar's gender, you can say, if Skylar is a man, I will buy him flowers. But the thing is, in this literature, they only consider two options in this case, him or her. Now, if we recognize the fact that for many speakers, it's also possible to use they in this context, then we suddenly see a much more gradient and much more variable pattern of judgments emerge. And we observe similar gradients and variation for TV features on pronouns. So in a context in which you say, don't remember the relevant convention between you and the addressee, you could say, look, I don't remember if we are on the T or on the V form basis, but if we are on the T form basis, you may call me Anya. The question is, which form do you use for you, T or V? And the answer is, it varies. Now, I don't have any bona fide quantitative data for either gender or TV, and I think such data should be collected at some point in the future. But even for small sets of speakers from fairly homogeneous populations, we already see rampant variation in these ignorance scenarios. So in these ignorance scenarios, for example, for gender, we see that some people categorically prefer they, regardless of what the local context is telling them. Some people can accept either they or the form supplied by the local context equally. And then some people can accept both, but have further preferences. And when it comes to TV, you basically have as many judgment patterns as you have speakers, and people also start asking a lot of follow-up questions and making a lot of follow-up comments, because for one thing, it kind of matters who you're talking to. Now, simply saying that gender and TV make these indexical contributions does not yet give us tools to explain these variation patterns. Here's two relevant intuitions that we could put forward at this point. One concerns gender. As I have already mentioned in the literature, people often use being female, being a woman, being a girl, and having she pronouns as equivalent things. But we know that for many people, there isn't a direct one-to-one mapping, not only between biological sex and pronouns, but even between social gender and pronouns. And some examples involve, for example, people with non-binary gender identity adopting binary pronouns, people adopting multiple pronouns regardless of how they identify and whether or not they identify within the binary. people adopting pronouns that do not match their gender identity as a form of gender nonconformity, and so on and so forth. And if you're a speaker who recognizes this lack of isomorphism between social gender and pronouns, then you might not be willing to conclude that if someone is a woman, they will necessarily use she pronouns. And another consideration is that unlike some other indexicals like person, gender, and TV come with this additional social baggage, and in particular, using the incorrect form can have very strong negative conversational effects, which a lot of speakers want to avoid. And in these counterfactual scenarios, it seems that most speakers want to avoid deliberately using incorrect forms to refer to someone. And it also looks like that some speakers consider accidental uses of incorrect forms undesirable as well, which is the case in those ignorance scenarios. Now, these two intuitions might seem obvious, and they are. Importantly, however, we also need to make space for them in our formal analysis. Now, let me add a very quick note, just to give credit where credit is due. I have cited two papers by Igor Yanovich in my slides. Now, this later manuscript from 2012 does in fact discuss various social aspects of pronoun use when it comes to gender. However, I think the empirical picture Yanovich assumes, and consequently the analysis that he proposes, are still incomplete, but it's going in the right direction. Now, here's what I propose. When it comes to lexical semantics of gender and TV on pronouns, I suggest that we abandon the assumption that they directly encode anything about the reference gender or their relationship with the speaker. Instead, I propose to treat them as something that I call form indexicals. So a form indexical has this general semantics in 10a. It denotes the property of an individual X such that the speaker of the context C believes a certain linguistic form to be an appropriate way to refer to X in C. Now, how do we decide which forms are appropriate and which aren't? Well, as your first recourse, you're just going to look it up in an index, the index of second-person pronouns and third-person pronouns for the various individuals that you know. The intuition here is that when you're talking about someone you know, you're not going to be sitting there desperately trying to remember something about their gender or something about your relationship. Instead, you're just going to use whatever you're used to using. Now, what is going to vary across individuals and situations and what is going to change over time is first what you do when your index doesn't have a relevant entry. Are you going to try to create one on the spot? Are you going to use an unmarked form? What are you going to do? The second locus of variation is going to be how you establish a new form. Do you establish it based on the perceived gender of this person, on their name? For TV features, it might differ a lot depending on the situation and who you're talking to. Another thing that is going to be different across speakers is the inventory of forms and their relative markedness status. And the final locus of variation will be what you do when you talk about groups of individuals and in particular non-specific individuals. Now, for triggering, we do not need to assume that gender or TV or any other 5 features contribute presuppositions that come with their own triggering mechanism. Instead, I propose that we follow my dissertation. I'm not going to go into any substantial detail, but the general idea is that we treat pronouns as definite descriptions, and we treat any 5 features or other pronoun internal modifiers as modifiers compositionally, except this property that they modify is the property of being identical to the value of the index of the pronoun, which means that its extension is always a singleton set. which means that any modifiers that modify this property are going to be non-restricting. They simply cannot restrict this property any further. And because of that, they will always be truth conditionally vacuous. That is, they will always be not at issue. And in this respect, phi features do fall into a natural class. It's just not a natural class of presuppositions. They behave just like any other descriptive content of any referential expressions. For example, if you say, the woman entered the room, what's at issue is whether the person you're talking about did in fact enter the room. What's not at issue, whether the person that you're talking about is in fact a woman. And this is in contrast to descriptive content of non-referential expressions, which is why we can ask questions like, are they he or is she? In which case, these pronouns he and she do not bear any indices, they're not referential, and they simply denote properties of basically having he pronouns versus she pronouns. Nor do we need presuppositions as a natural class to talk about projection patterns of gender and TV on pronouns. Instead, we should think of projection of gender and TV as this process of selecting a form that is appropriate in a given context. And this process is going to be affected by a variety of utterance internal and crucially utterance external factors, including the social cost of using the wrong form. And the same logic will apply to quantificational cases as well, except the reasoning will become slightly more complicated because now you have to reason about a group of individuals rather than just one. I do want to very briefly discuss one relevant example of gender in quantificational contexts. Not everyone, obviously, but some people have this pattern where they can use arbitrary gendered forms when they're talking about non-specific individuals in quantificational contexts without intending any universal inferences. But they cannot do the same thing when they're talking about a group of specific people. So they can say something like, if you make a friend, you should be kind to her, without intending for there to be an inference that if you make a friend, that friend will necessarily have she pronouns. However, if they say every friend of mine likes her job, now they do intend an inference that all their friends have she pronouns. Treating this issue as just an issue of projection patterns of presuppositions that are given to us by some presupposition god doesn't help us explain why people have this pattern. However, one relevant consideration here seems to be that in the first case, you're not at risk of accidentally misgendering anyone because you're not talking about anyone specific, which is not exactly the case in the second example. Now, this is not the only relevant consideration, but this consideration at least offers a direction for us to start explaining this pattern here. So here's my takeaway points for gender and TV on pronouns. One, we need to make space in our lexical entries for all these varied patterns of mapping between a given pronoun form and some other property of the individual, such as their gender or their relationship to the speaker or something else. Two, the contributions of gender and TV on referring pronouns are not at issue. They project for configurational reasons, not because they are special somehow lexically. And finally, the apparent projection of gender and TV should be treated as this multi-factorial process of selecting a context-appropriate form. And generalizing from this case study, we can conclude that first, the specific form of a given projecting inference matters for the issues of projection. And two, the nature of triggering and the projection patterns for a given inference need to be studied on a case-by-case basis. And adopting such broad umbrella categories as presuppositions is not particularly helpful in this respect. So this is all I have to say for today. Thank you for your attention, and I'm looking forward to your questions.